Millionaire was on dinner date when he sees a waitress wearing his late wife's wedding ring and discovers the heartbreaking truth. The silver band caught the light, sending a flash of recognition through Jonathan Reed so visceral it was like being struck by lightning. His lungs seized. His vision tunneled to a pinpoint focused entirely on the waitress's slender hand as she poured wine into his glass. That ring. Elena's ring. The unique pattern of intertwined vines and small inset sapphires was unmistakable. He'd designed it himself, had it custom-made by an artisan jeweler in Florence during their honeymoon. "Is everything all right, sir?" The waitress, Sophie, according to her name tag, was looking at him with growing concern. Only then did Jonathan realize he'd grabbed her wrist, freezing her mid-pour. Wine sloshed dangerously close to the rim of his glass, threatening to spill onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Your ring," he said, his voice barely audible over the restaurant's ambient noise. "Where did you get it?" Sophie's eyes widened slightly, darting from her hand to his face. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise? Guilt? "Oh, this?" She twisted it self-consciously. "A kind woman left it as a tip last month." A ringing began in Jonathan's ears, drowning out Margaret's concerned voice asking if he was feeling well. Margaret, his dinner companion. The widow his family had practically forced him to meet tonight in their endless campaign to help him move on. Move on. As if grief were a train station you could simply leave behind. Impossible. This was impossible. Elena had been wearing that ring when they'd said goodbye that morning. The last morning. She kissed him distractedly as he typed furiously on his laptop, working through a critical issue with investors that couldn't wait. "Jonathan, can we talk tonight? Really talk?" she'd asked, her hand lingering on his shoulder. Sure, he'd replied without looking up. "I'll try to be home early." He never made it home early. She never made it home at all. And they'd never found her body in the twisted wreckage of her car after it plunged off the coastal highway. But they'd assured him no one could have survived. The impact, the fire, the 60-foot drop into churning waters. Before we dive deep into this heartfelt story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Enjoy the story. "Sir?" Sophie was trying to gently extract her wrist from his grip, her expression increasingly alarmed. "Who was she?" Jonathan demanded, his voice sharper than intended. "The woman who gave you this ring. What did she look like?" Margaret was staring at him now, her brow furrowed with concern. "Jonathan, what's wrong?" Her auburn hair caught the light as she leaned forward, the elegant woman his brother had described as perfect for you. She understands loss. As if understanding equated to healing. As if anything could fill the Elena-shaped void in his life. "This ring," he said, still not releasing Sophie's wrist. "It belonged to my wife." Sophie's face paled. "Your wife?" "She died 2 years ago." The words felt like glass in his throat. That ring was on her finger when she died. The restaurant seemed to spin around him, the ambient chatter fading into a dull roar as blood pounded in his ears. If the ring was here, if it had somehow found its way onto this waitress's hand, is Elena alive? The thought hit him with such force that he actually gasped. It was irrational, impossible, the desperate hope of a man who had never fully accepted his loss. And yet... "I'm sorry, but you must be mistaken," Sophie said, her voice taking on an edge. "Like I said, a customer gave it to me as a tip. It was a nice lady, older, gray hair, I think. I don't remember exactly." Her eyes wouldn't meet his. She was lying. Jonathan had built a fortune by reading people across negotiating tables, and this young woman was definitely hiding something. "I need to see your security footage," he said, releasing her wrist and standing abruptly. "Where's your manager?" "Jonathan," Margaret's voice cut through his tunnel vision. "You're causing a scene." Please sit down." He became aware of the nearby tables. Conversations paused as patrons glanced curiously in their direction. The maitre d' was already moving their way, professional concern on his face. "Is everything all right here?" the man asked, his voice low. "I need to see your security footage from last month," Jonathan said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "It's urgent." The manager's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened slightly. "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir. Perhaps we could discuss this in my office?" 20 minutes later, Jonathan stood in the restaurant's back office, hands gripping the edge of a desk as the manager, James Chen, according to his nameplate, delivered the news with apologetic precision. "Our system automatically overwrites footage after 2 weeks unless specifically archived. Corporate policy. Then you must have records, credit card transactions, reservation details, something to identify a woman who would have dined here last month." Chen spread his hands helplessly. "Without a specific date, it would be nearly impossible. We serve hundreds of guests each week." Jonathan felt the control he'd maintained for 2 years starting to crack. The possibility that Elena might be alive had ignited a wildfire in his chest that threatened to consume him. "That ring was custom-made, one of a kind. It belonged to my wife, who supposedly died 2 years ago." His voice rose despite his efforts to keep it level. "And somehow, it ended up on your waitress's finger. You understand why this matters to me." Chen's expression softened slightly. "I truly am sorry for your loss, Mr. Reed, but there's nothing in our system that would help you." He hesitated. "Though I do find it strange that Sophie said she received it last month. She's only been working here for 3 weeks. Jonathan's eyes snapped up, meeting Chen's. "She lied." "It seems so," Chen agreed quietly. Jonathan's phone vibrated in his pocket. Margaret. He'd left her sitting alone at the table, probably confused and offended. He silenced it without looking. This was more important than social niceties. This was Elena. "I need to speak with Sophie again," he said, already moving toward the door. Chen caught his arm. "Mr. Reed, she left, asked to go home early, said she wasn't feeling well." A cold certainty settled in Jonathan's gut. She ran. "Address?" Jonathan demanded, his voice like steel. "I need her home address." Chen shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Reed, I can't give out personal information about our employees. There are privacy laws. I'll double your annual salary right now." Jonathan pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over the banking app. "One transfer. For an address." Chen stared at him, conflicted. "Sir, I could lose my job." "I'll hire you somewhere better." The words came automatically, the same ruthless efficiency that had built Reed Enterprises from nothing. "Or you can tell me where employee files are kept, and I'll find it myself." A flicker of resignation crossed Chen's face. "Give me a moment." While Chen stepped out, Jonathan paced the small office, mind racing. The persistent buzzing of his phone had stopped, then started again. Margaret had now called 3 times. He should text her at least. Apologize. Explain. But how could he explain something he didn't understand himself? "Sorry, had to chase down a waitress who might be my link to my not-actually-dead wife." His fingers raked through his dark hair, disheveling the careful styling his assistant had insisted on before this dinner. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Diane had fussed, straightening his tie. She wasn't wrong. Sleep had been his enemy for years now, bringing with it dreams of Elena, vibrant and alive, only to cruelly vanish with the morning light. Chen returned, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. "I shouldn't be doing this." Jonathan glanced at the address, an apartment complex in the West Side, about 20 minutes away. "You're doing the right thing." He transferred $5,000 to Chen's account on the spot, a down payment on his promise. "Mr. Reed," Chen called as Jonathan reached the door. Whatever you're looking for, I hope you find it." The drive to Sophie's apartment was a blur of streetlights and honking horns as Jonathan weaved his Tesla through evening traffic with dangerous precision. His knuckles whitened against the steering wheel, the only outward sign of the storm brewing inside him. What if Elena is alive? The thought circled his mind like a shark, both tantalizing and terrifying. He'd spent 2 years rebuilding himself around her absence, a hollowed-out version of the man he once was, but functional nonetheless. If there was even a chance. The apartment building was unremarkable. Beige stucco with peeling paint around the windows, a far cry from the luxury high-rise where he lived. Jonathan parked haphazardly in a spot marked Visitors and scanned the directory beside the security door. S. Williams, apartment 214. He pressed the buzzer and waited, heart hammering against his ribs. No answer. Again. Still nothing. A young woman with grocery bags approached, eyeing him warily. "I'm looking for Sophie," he said quickly. "Sophie Williams. It's important." "Are you a debt collector or something?" Her eyes assessed his tailored suit, clearly finding him out of place. What was he? "I'm trying to return something valuable that belongs to her." Not entirely a lie. The woman shrugged and held the door open as she entered her key code. "Whatever. She's probably with her mom anyway. She's always there after shifts." Jonathan slipped inside before the door closed. "Her mother?" "Yeah, over at Cedars-Sinai, cancer ward. Everyone knows Sophie's working 3 jobs to pay the medical bills." She disappeared down the hallway, leaving Jonathan in the dimly lit lobby. Cedars-Sinai, cancer ward. 15 minutes later, Jonathan strode through the hospital's main entrance, a man with purpose. The reception desk was staffed by a tired-looking woman whose badge read, Marlene. "I'm looking for a patient," he said, "last name Williams. Her daughter Sophie works at Haute Cuisine on Wilshire." Marlene's fingers clacked on the keyboard. Williams. "Ah, Patricia Williams. 5th floor, room 537. She squinted at him. "Visiting hours end at 8, though. You've got about 40 minutes. The elevator ride felt endless. Jonathan's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man he barely recognized. Eyes wild with desperate hope, jaw set with determination. When had he become this person? When you lost her. When you lost everything that mattered. Room 537's door was partially open. He could hear hushed voices inside. One of them was Sophie's. Just asking questions. About the ring. "What did you tell him?" A weaker voice, presumably her mother's. "That someone gave it to me as a tip. But Mom, he knew it was custom-made. He said it belonged to his dead wife." "Oh, Sophie, I told you not to wear it to work." Jonathan's breath caught. He pushed the door open wider, causing both women to look up in alarm. Sophie jolted to her feet. "You! How did you find me?" Jonathan barely registered her words. His attention was fixed on the frail woman in the hospital bed, pale, thin, with a colorful scarf wrapped around her hairless head. Not Elena. Of course not Elena. The foolish hope that had been building crumbled to dust. "Mr. Reed?" Sophie stepped between him and her mother, protective. "You need to leave. Now." "The ring," he said, his voice hollow. "Just tell me the truth about the ring." Patricia Williams coughed weakly. "Sophie, it's all right." She gestured for Jonathan to come closer. "You're the man who designed it, aren't you? For your wife?" Jonathan nodded, unable to speak. "It's beautiful craftsmanship," she said softly. "I found it in the lost and found box at the restaurant. I worked, in the coat check until the chemo got too bad." "Mom," Sophie protested, but Patricia waved her off. "Sophie needed money for my treatments. The insurance only covers so much. She was going to pawn it." Patricia's eyes, though tired, were direct. "I know it was wrong, but when you're dying, right and wrong start to look different." The truth settled over Jonathan like a shroud. There was no mystery here, no miracle, just a desperate daughter trying to save her mother. "The restaurant's lost and found," he repeated flatly. "How long ago?" 3, maybe 4 weeks, Patricia replied. "It was just sitting there in a little dish. No one had claimed it for days." Jonathan sank into the visitor's chair, suddenly exhausted. "Did you see who left it?" Patricia shook her head. But she hesitated. There was something with it. A note. Sophie's head snapped up. "What note? You never mentioned a note." "It wasn't for us, honey." Patricia's hand trembled as she reached for the drawer in her bedside table. "I should have turned it in, but, well, you know why I didn't." From the drawer, she pulled out a small folded piece of paper, creased and worn. It was wrapped around the ring. Jonathan took it with unsteady fingers. The paper was expensive, heavy stock, the handwriting achingly familiar. "For Jay. I'm still here. Find me." The world tilted beneath him. Elena's handwriting, Elena's words. "Are you okay?" Sophie's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You look like you're going to pass out." "My wife," Jonathan managed to say, holding up the note like a talisman. "This is my wife's handwriting. She's alive." "But you said she died," Sophie said, confused. "They never found her body." The words tumbled out, fueled by renewed hope and dawning horror. "There was a car accident. Her car went off a cliff. They told me no one could have survived, but they never found her." Jonathan stood abruptly. "I need to go. I need to—" What? Where did one even begin looking for a wife who had been dead for 2 years? His phone rang again. Margaret? No, an unknown number this time. He answered without thinking. Jonathan Reed. "Mr. Reed." The voice was male, smooth, professional. "My name is Marcus Vega. I'm a private investigator. I understand you're looking for information about your wife." Jonathan froze. "Who told you that?" "How did you get this number?" "Let's just say I have sources at certain restaurants." There was a knowing pause. "If you're interested in finding the truth, meet me at Westfield Park, the bench by the Eastern Fountain. 1 hour." The line went dead. Sophie was watching him, her expression caught between suspicion and concern. "What's happening?" Jonathan looked down at the note again, running his thumb over the elegant curve of Elena's handwriting. "I'm still here. Find me." "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card along with several $100 bills. "For your mother's treatment, and if you remember anything else about the ring, call me. Any time." Sophie hesitated, then took the card, leaving the money on the table. "I hope you find her," she said quietly. "Your wife." As Jonathan headed for the door, Patricia called out to him. "Mr. Reed, whoever she is, wherever she is, she went to a lot of trouble to get your attention. The question is, why didn't she just come to you directly?" The question followed him all the way to his car. "Why, Elena? What happened to you, and who are you hiding from?" Westfield Park was nearly deserted at this hour, the evening chill having driven away all but the most determined joggers and dog walkers. Jonathan sat on the designated bench, the ornate fountain gurgling behind him, sending occasional mist to dampen his shoulders. He didn't notice. His mind was consumed by the note clutched in his hand. "For Jay. I'm still here. Find me." 6 words. 6 simple words that had shattered the foundations of his existence. If Elena was alive, where had she been for 2 years? Why had she let him believe she was dead? And why reach out now, in such a cryptic manner? Mr. Reed. Jonathan looked up to see a man approaching, mid-40s, trim build, with the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to noticing details. He wore a charcoal peacoat and carried a leather messenger bag that had seen better days. Marcus Vega. Jonathan stood, extending his hand automatically, the businessman in him asserting itself even now. Vega's handshake was firm but brief. Thank you for meeting me. He glanced around, surveying the empty park with practiced attention. I prefer to conduct initial meetings in public spaces. Safer for everyone involved. How did you know I was looking into my wife's death? Jonathan asked, dispensing with pleasantries. Vega sat on the bench, setting his bag beside him. James Chen and I go back. He called me after your encounter at the restaurant. A thin smile crossed his face. Chen thought you might need professional help rather than stumbling around interrogating waitresses. Jonathan remained standing, unwilling to cede even this small advantage of height. And you just happen to have my number? You're Jonathan Reed. Finding your contact information took about 3 minutes online. Vega gestured to the empty space on the bench. Please sit, Mr. Reed. What I have to tell you isn't the kind of news you'll want to hear standing up. A cold knot formed in Jonathan's stomach as he lowered himself onto the bench. You know something about Elena? I know many things about Elena Reed, née Khoury. Vega reached into his bag and withdrew a manila folder. 34 years old at the time of her alleged death, Stanford graduate, worked in architectural design before marrying you. No children, no surviving family except for a distant cousin in Boston. This isn't telling me anything I don't already know, Jonathan said, impatience edging into his voice. Context is important, Mr. Reed. Vega opened the folder and removed a photograph, passing it to Jonathan. The image showed Elena, unmistakably Elena, walking through what appeared to be a hotel lobby. Her hair was shorter, dyed a lighter shade, but it was her. The timestamp in the corner read August 15, 2023. 14 months after her supposed death. Jonathan's fingers trembled as he held the photograph. Where was this taken? The Grand Harbor Hotel, downtown. Vega's voice remained professionally detached. I was working a different case, corporate espionage involving one of their guests. She was in the background of my surveillance photos. I didn't think anything of it at the time. But you recognized her now? After Chen called, I revisited some old files. Your wife's obituary photo was quite memorable. When I realized what I might have, I figured you'd pay well for the information. Vega met Jonathan's gaze without apology. I'm a businessman, Mr. Reed, just like you. Jonathan barely heard him, still staring at the photograph. Elena, alive, walking through a hotel lobby as if she hadn't torn his world apart, as if she hadn't left him drowning in grief for 2 years. There's more, Vega continued, withdrawing another photo. This one's from 3 months ago. This image showed Elena again, entering a high-end boutique on Rodeo Drive. Her hair was now dark again, styled differently, but her profile was unmistakable. She wore large sunglasses and carried an expensive handbag that Jonathan didn't recognize, not one he had bought her. Someone's financing her new life, Vega commented, watching Jonathan's face closely, and doing a good job of keeping her hidden until recently. Who? Jonathan's question came out as barely more than a whisper. That's where things get interesting. Vega removed a third photograph. Meet Victor Sterling. The photo showed a distinguished man in his 50s, silver-haired, tanned, exuding the easy confidence of old money, and beside him, with his hand resting possessively on her lower back, was Elena. Sterling Developments, Jonathan said, recognition dawning. My main competitor for the Bayside project. The very same. Vega nodded. Sterling's company has been trying to outbid you on every major project for the past 3 years, but lately they've been especially aggressive about Bayside. Jonathan's mind raced, connecting dots at lightning speed. The Bayside deal closes next week. I'm meeting with investors on Monday. He looked up sharply. Are you suggesting Elena is… What? Working with Sterling to sabotage me? Vega shrugged. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm presenting facts. Your wife, who was presumed dead, has been spotted multiple times in the company of your biggest business rival. Draw your own conclusions. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Jonathan could have imagined. Not just alive, but aligned with Sterling, using their intimate knowledge of him and his business to undermine everything he'd built? There had to be another explanation. The note, Jonathan said suddenly. If she's with Sterling willingly, why would she leave me a note asking me to find her? What note? Jonathan hesitated, then carefully unfolded the paper from his pocket, showing it to Vega without releasing it. This was wrapped around Elena's wedding ring when it was left at the restaurant. Vega studied it, his expression calculating. Could be a trap. Lure you in, distract you from the Bayside deal. Or she could be reaching out for help. Jonathan pocketed the note again. Maybe she's not with Sterling by choice. That's a possibility I considered. Vega's tone shifted slightly. Sterling has a reputation. Nothing concrete, nothing that would stand up in court, but there are rumors. Women who've worked for him and suddenly disappeared. Competitors who faced unusual accidents. The kind of things powerful men can make go away. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air swept through Jonathan. You think he's holding her against her will? I think, Vega said carefully, that a woman trying to send a message while being watched would resort to exactly this kind of indirect communication. Leaving a ring where it might eventually find its way to you, with a note vague enough to seem meaningless to anyone else. Hope and dread warred within Jonathan's chest. I need to find her. Now. Sterling owns multiple properties throughout the city. Finding which one she might be in won't be easy. Vega reached into his bag again and removed a business card. My standard rate is $800 per day, plus expenses. I'll need a $5,000 retainer to start. Jonathan took the card without looking at it. Money isn't an issue. Time is. If Elena's in danger… I'll start tonight, Vega assured him. But Mr. Reed… His voice sharpened. Don't do anything stupid. If Sterling is involved in your wife's disappearance, he's dangerous. Let me do my job. Understood. The lie came easily. Jonathan had no intention of sitting idle while Elena might be in danger. I'll wait for your call. They parted ways at the edge of the park, Vega heading toward a nondescript sedan while Jonathan returned to his Tesla. Once inside, he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Diane, I need you to cancel all my meetings for the next week and get me everything we have on Victor Sterling and Sterling Developments. Not just the business intelligence, everything. Properties, holdings, personal information. Yes, even if it's not strictly legal. He ended the call and sat for a moment, staring at the dashboard without seeing it. The photograph of Elena with Sterling burned in his mind, alongside the words from her note. I'm still here. Find me. I will, he whispered to the empty car. I promise. Margaret Sullivan wrapped her cashmere cardigan tighter around her shoulders, watching the city lights from her penthouse balcony. Her phone lay on the glass table beside an untouched glass of wine, the screen dark after her final unanswered call to Jonathan. The sliding door opened behind her. Any word? The male voice was crisp, businesslike. No, Margaret replied without turning. He ran out of the restaurant. Something about the waitress's ring. Damn it! Victor Sterling moved to stand beside her, his imposing silhouette outlined against the city glow. What exactly did he see? Elena's ring. He recognized it immediately. Margaret took a sip of wine, her hand steady despite the tension in her shoulders. I told you this plan was too risky. Using her actual wedding ring? What were you thinking? I was thinking that Jonathan Reed needed proper motivation. Sterling's voice held the cold efficiency that had built his empire. The Bayside deal is worth billions. I need him distracted, not mildly curious. Well, he's more than distracted now. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Margaret turned to face Sterling. This is getting out of hand, Victor. I agreed to get close to him, to help you understand his business plans. I didn't sign up for whatever this is becoming. Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. You signed up for exactly what I'm paying you for, Margaret. Remember who cleared your late husband's debts. Remember who owns the mortgage on this lovely penthouse. His fingers brushed her cheek in a gesture that might have seemed affectionate to an observer but made Margaret flinch. We're so close. The deal closes next week. And then what? She asked quietly. What happens to Elena once you get what you want? Sterling stepped back, straightening his already immaculate suit. That's not your concern. Your job is to keep an eye on Reed. Find out what he knows, who he's talking to. He moved toward the door. And Margaret? Don't disappoint me. People who disappoint me tend to have unfortunate accidents. Just ask Elena. After he left, Margaret remained on the balcony for a long time, staring at the city below. Finally, she picked up her phone and found Jonathan's number. Her finger hovered over the call button for several heartbeats before she set it down again. Instead, she opened her text messages and typed a simple warning to a number she'd never contacted before. He knows about the ring. Be careful. Across town, in a luxury guest house on Sterling's estate, a phone vibrated softly. Elena Reed read the message, her face pale in the dim light, and quickly deleted it. Then she moved to the window, watching the security guards patrolling the immaculate grounds of her beautiful prison. Hurry, Jonathan, she thought. Find me before it's too late. Morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jonathan's penthouse office, illuminating the chaos that had overtaken the usually pristine space. Maps covered the glass conference table, red markers circling various properties. Laptop screens displayed property records, satellite images, and financial statements. Coffee cups littered every surface, testament to the sleepless night. Jonathan stood at the window, phone pressed to his ear, watching the city wake up. A city where, somewhere, Elena was alive. Nothing from the Grand Harbor's security footage? He asked, rubbing the stubble that had formed on his jaw overnight. Their system only keeps recordings for 60 days, Diane replied, her voice betraying her own exhaustion. As his executive assistant for 6 years, she'd seen him through every crisis, though none quite like this. But I did get Sterling's property portfolio. He owns 17 properties in the greater Los Angeles area alone. 17, Jonathan repeated, the number hanging heavy in the air. 17 possible places where Elena might be held. Which ones are residential? 8, 3 mansions, 2 penthouses, a beachfront property in Malibu, and 2 guest houses on larger estates. Jonathan turned from the window, crossing to the maps. Send the addresses. A knock interrupted him. Diane stood in the doorway, phone still at her ear, eyebrows raised in a silent question. I'll call you back, he said needlessly, ending the call. What is it? Marcus Vega's here, says it's urgent. Her eyes took in his disheveled appearance, the rumpled shirt, the dark circles under his eyes. Should I send him in? Or do you want a few minutes to send him in? Jonathan didn't care how he looked. Not now. Vega entered moments later, his composed demeanor a stark contrast to Jonathan's disarray. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of restrained urgency. You've been busy, he commented, taking in the evidence of Jonathan's overnight investigation. What have you found? Jonathan asked, skipping the pleasantries. Vega set his briefcase on the one clear corner of the table and extracted a folder. Sterling owns a compound in Bel Air, heavily secured, guards, cameras, the works. He laid out several surveillance photos. I managed to get close enough last night to capture these. The images showed a Spanish-style mansion set behind imposing gates, with manicured gardens and a separate guest house partially visible in the background. Men in dark uniforms patrolled the perimeter. "And?" Jonathan prompted, impatience coloring his voice. "And," Vega said, placing one final photograph on top, "there's this." The image was grainy, clearly taken with a powerful zoom lens through foliage, but unmistakable. A woman stood at an upstairs window of the guest house, her silhouette outlined against interior light. Even from a distance, even slightly blurred, Jonathan would know that profile anywhere. "Elena," he whispered, fingers hovering over the photograph as if he might touch her through the paper. "I can't be 100% certain," Vega cautioned, "but the height, build, and what's visible of her features match your wife's description." Jonathan's heart hammered against his ribs. "We need to get her out. Now." "That's not as simple as it sounds," Vega said, spreading out more photos showing the security measures. Sterling's compound is essentially a fortress. 6 guards rotating shifts, motion sensors on the grounds, cameras covering every angle of approach. "I don't care. I'll call the police." "And tell them what?" Vega interjected. "That your supposedly dead wife is being held in Victor Sterling's guest house, based on a grainy photo and a mysterious note? Sterling has half the LAPD brass in his pocket. They'd laugh you out of the station, or worse, tip him off." Jonathan slammed his fist on the table, sending coffee cups rattling. "I am not leaving her there." "I'm not suggesting you do," Vega replied, unfazed by the outburst. "I'm suggesting we be smart about this." He reached back into his briefcase and withdrew a floor plan. "Sterling is hosting a charity gala tomorrow night, benefiting cancer research at Cedars-Sinai, ironically enough. The event will be held at his main house, with approximately 200 guests expected to attend." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "A distraction." "Exactly." Vega pointed to the guest house on the floor plan. "Security will be focused on the main event. The guest house is connected to the main house by a garden path, here. If you could secure an invitation—" "I can," Jonathan interrupted. His company regularly received invitations to such events, though he usually sent Diane or other executives in his place. "But Sterling knows me. He'll be suspicious if I suddenly appear at his gala. He's expecting you to be distracted by the Bayside deal. Your appearance at a charity event would seem like business as usual. Networking, maintaining appearances." Vega's voice took on a harder edge. "Besides, don't you think he'd enjoy the chance to gloat? To watch you schmooze and network while he keeps your wife prisoner on the same property?" The thought made Jonathan's stomach turn. The idea of making pleasant conversation while Elena was so close, yet still captive, was almost unbearable. "While you keep Sterling occupied at the main house," Vega continued, "I can access the guest house through this service entrance. Get your wife out while everyone's attention is elsewhere." It was risky. Countless things could go wrong. But as Jonathan looked again at the photograph of Elena's silhouette in the window, he knew he had no choice. "Make it happen," he said. As Vega gathered his materials, Jonathan's phone buzzed with an incoming text. "Margaret." He'd completely forgotten about her after abandoning her at the restaurant. "We need to talk. About last night. About the ring." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "One more thing," he said to Vega. "What do you know about Margaret Sullivan?" Vega paused, his expression shifting subtly. "The woman you were dining with?" "Widow of Lawrence Sullivan, the shipping magnate. He died last year, heart attack. Left her comfortable but not wealthy." "Why?" "She's been texting me, wants to discuss the ring." Jonathan showed him the message. Vega's eyes narrowed. "Interesting timing. How did you meet her?" "My brother introduced us. Said she'd be perfect for me. Another widow who understands grief." The words sounded hollow now, laced with suspicion. You think she's involved? I think, Vega said carefully, that coincidences make me nervous, especially when Victor Sterling is in the picture. He closed his briefcase with a decisive click. Meet with her. Find out what she knows. But be careful what you reveal. After Vega left, Jonathan stared at Margaret's text for a long moment before replying. Lunch today. 1 p.m., my office. The response came almost immediately. I'll be there. Margaret arrived precisely at 1, dressed in an understated navy dress that somehow managed to suggest both wealth and restraint. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant updo, her makeup flawless. If she was nervous, it didn't show, until she saw the state of Jonathan's office. My goodness, she said, taken aback by the maps and documents still covering every surface. What happened here? Jonathan had showered and changed, but deliberately left the evidence of his investigation visible. He wanted to see her reaction. Research, he said simply, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Thank you for coming. Margaret sat, her posture perfect, hands folded in her lap. I was worried about you, Jonathan. The way you rushed out last night. She hesitated. That waitress's ring upset you deeply. It belonged to my wife, he said, watching her face carefully. Yes, you mentioned that. Her expression remained sympathetic, concerned. I can't imagine how painful that must have been. To see something so personal, so unexpectedly. The thing is, Jonathan continued, leaning forward slightly, Elena was wearing that ring when she died. Her car went off a cliff, into the ocean. They never recovered her body. A flicker of something, surprise, alarm, crossed Margaret's features before she composed herself. How terrible for you, but perhaps it's not the same ring. Jewelry designs can be similar. It was custom-made, one of a kind. Jonathan kept his tone conversational, though every nerve was on alert. The waitress found it in the restaurant's Lost and Found. Recently. Margaret's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her handbag. That is unusual. Isn't it? Jonathan leaned back, his gaze never leaving her face. Makes me wonder how it got there, and why someone would leave it where I might find it. Perhaps. Margaret seemed to choose her words carefully. Perhaps someone wanted to return it to you, as a kindness. Or as a message. Jonathan let the statement hang in the air between them. Margaret's composure slipped, just slightly. A small intake of breath, a quick glance toward the door. What kind of message? Now he was certain. Margaret knew something. Her discomfort was too specific, too tied to his questions about the ring. Tell me, Margaret, he said, his voice deceptively gentle. How well do you know Victor Sterling? The color drained from her face so rapidly that for a moment Jonathan thought she might faint. I don't understand. What does Victor Sterling have to do with your wife's ring? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Jonathan stood, walking around to lean against the front of his desk, now looming over her seated form. You see, I've discovered some interesting connections. My wife's ring mysteriously appearing at the exact restaurant where you insisted we have dinner. Victor Sterling, my chief business rival, who's been desperately trying to sabotage the Bayside deal. And now you, looking like you've seen a ghost at the mere mention of his name. Margaret's hand flew to her throat, a defensive gesture. Jonathan, you're frightening me. I don't know what you think. I think, he cut in, his voice hardening, that you're going to tell me everything you know about Elena. Right now. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. Whether genuine or calculated, he couldn't tell. Please, you don't understand. He'll kill me if I talk to you. And what do you think I'll do if you don't? The cold fury in his voice surprised even him. A tear spilled down her cheek. She's alive, Margaret whispered, the words barely audible. Your wife is alive. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over Sterling's grand ballroom, illuminating the social elite of Los Angeles as they mingled, champagne flutes in hand, checkbooks at the ready. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing the perfect soundtrack for performative philanthropy. Jonathan navigated through the crowd, nodding at familiar faces, his tuxedo impeccable. No one would guess that beneath his polished exterior, every muscle was coiled tight with tension, every sense on high alert. Margaret's confession had confirmed his worst fears and his greatest hopes. Sterling took her after the accident. Her car really did go off the cliff, but she survived. His men pulled her from the wreckage before the authorities arrived. Why? For leverage. Against you. Against your company. He's obsessed with the Bayside project. Says it's the cornerstone of his legacy. The memory of Margaret's tearful confession echoed in his mind as he scanned the room, looking for his host. Vega's words buzzed in his earpiece, disguised as a hearing aid. Guards are rotating on schedule. 2 at the main gate, 1 patrolling the western perimeter, 2 by the main house. The path to the guest house is clear for now. Jonathan touched his ear in acknowledgement, careful not to draw attention. According to their plan, he needed to keep Sterling engaged for at least 20 minutes while Vega made his way to Elena. There, across the room, Victor Sterling held court near the bar, surrounded by admirers. Tall and distinguished, with silver hair that caught the light, he radiated the easy confidence of a man accustomed to power. Jonathan felt a surge of rage so intense he had to pause, forcing himself to breathe deeply before continuing his approach. This man had stolen 2 years of their lives. 2 years Jonathan could never get back. "Jonathan Reed," Sterling called out, noticing him. His smile was perfect, predatory. "What an unexpected pleasure. I didn't think you'd tear yourself away from the Bayside preparations." "Some causes are worth supporting," Jonathan replied, his own smile never reaching his eyes, "even if it means crossing enemy lines." Sterling laughed, a rich sound designed to put others at ease. "Enemy? Such a harsh word. I prefer competitor." He gestured to the crowd. "Besides, tonight isn't about business, it's about giving back." "How noble of you." Jonathan accepted a champagne flute from a passing server, never taking his eyes off Sterling. "Though I'm curious about your sudden interest in cancer research." "My mother died of lymphoma," Sterling said smoothly. "It's a cause close to my heart." Liar, Jonathan thought. According to Margaret, Sterling had chosen Cedars-Sinai specifically to monitor Sophie and her mother, ensuring they couldn't reveal anything about the ring. "Movement at the guest house," Vega murmured in his ear. "Eastern window. I see her." Jonathan's heart leapt, but his face betrayed nothing. "To mothers, then," he said, raising his glass to Sterling, "and to family." Something dangerous flickered in Sterling's eyes. "Indeed, though as I recall, you've been rather unlucky in that department." The taunt was deliberate, testing. Jonathan forced himself to appear unfazed. "Life is full of surprises. Wouldn't you agree?" Sterling studied him for a long moment. "Margaret tells me you were quite upset at dinner the other night. Something about a ring." "Keep him talking. Keep him focused on you." "A momentary shock," Jonathan said with practiced casualness. "Grief plays tricks on the mind." "Approaching the guest house now," Vega whispered. Sterling stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Does it? And what tricks has it been playing lately, Jonathan? What have you been seeing in the dark hours of the night?" The conversation had shifted, becoming something more dangerous. Sterling was probing, suspicious. "Guard approaching your position, Vega," Jonathan said quietly, disguising the warning by raising his glass to his lips. Sterling's eyes narrowed. "Talking to yourself, Jonathan? That can't be healthy." Just thinking aloud about the Bayside project, Jonathan countered. Your attempted hostile takeover has been entertaining. Sterling's mask of geniality slipped, just slightly. That project should have been mine. The city council chose the better proposal, Jonathan interrupted, deliberately provoking him. Better design, better environmental impact, better community benefits. The guest house is locked, Vega's voice came, tense with urgency. Need 2 more minutes. Sterling's jaw tightened. You always did think you were better than everyone else, even in college. The golden boy, the natural talent. Jonathan hadn't realized Sterling's resentment stretched back that far. This is about proving something. Taking my company, taking my... He caught himself just in time. But Sterling had caught it too. His eyes sharpened, calculation replacing anger. Taking your what, Jonathan? Your position, Jonathan recovered smoothly. In the industry. I'm in, Vega whispered, moving to the second floor. Sterling was watching him too closely now, suspicion evident in his posture. You know, he said softly, I have the strangest feeling you're not really here for the charity auction. From across the room, a commotion erupted. Security guards speaking urgently into radios, moving with sudden purpose toward the exit. Sir, one of them approached Sterling. There's been a breach at the guest house. Sterling's gaze locked with Jonathan's, understanding dawning with murderous clarity. You know, he breathed, the words barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. Jonathan dropped all pretense. If you've hurt her... Security breach at the main gate. Vega's voice crackled with static. I've got her, but we're cut off from the planned exit. Sterling smiled, cold and triumphant. Did you really think it would be that easy? That I wouldn't be prepared? He leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper. She's mine now. Has been for 2 years. You'll never see her again. Jonathan's control snapped. His fist connected with Sterling's jaw, sending the older man staggering back against the bar. Gasps rippled through the crowd as champagne glasses shattered on the marble floor. Jonathan! The voice cut through the chaos like a shaft of light through darkness. He turned, heart stopping at the sight of her. Elena stood in the doorway, breathless, Vega behind her with a gun drawn, keeping the security guards at bay. Her hair was different, her face thinner than he remembered, but her eyes, those brilliant, defiant eyes, were exactly the same. Elena, he breathed, unable to move, unable to believe. She ran to him, colliding with such force it nearly knocked him over. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her tears wet against his cheek. I knew you'd find me, she whispered. I knew you'd come. Behind them, Sterling rose to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip. This changes nothing, he snarled. You're trespassing on my property, my security. Will, stand down, came a new voice. Margaret stood in the entrance, flanked by police officers. It's over, Victor. Sterling's face contorted with rage. You treacherous bitch! After everything I did for you... After you blackmailed me, Margaret corrected him. After you threatened me. She turned to the police captain. Victor Sterling orchestrated the abduction of Elena Reed 2 years ago and has held her against her will ever since. I have documented proof of his planning, his threats, and his financial arrangements to keep her captive. As the officers moved toward Sterling, he lunged for a security guard's weapon. The ballroom erupted in screams, people diving for cover. Jonathan, down! Vega shouted, but it was Elena who moved fastest, shoving Jonathan aside as Sterling fired. The bullet meant for Jonathan grazed her shoulder instead, tearing through fabric and flesh before Sterling was tackled to the ground by officers. Elena! Jonathan caught her as she stumbled, crimson blooming across the silk of her dress. It's okay, she gasped, her hand pressed to the wound. It's just a graze. I'm okay. He held her, mindless of the blood staining his tuxedo. of the chaos surrounding them. "I thought you were dead," he whispered against her hair. "For 2 years, I thought you were gone forever." "I never stopped trying to reach you," she said, her voice stronger now despite the pain. "He kept me isolated, monitored. The ring was my only chance. I slipped it to a kitchen worker during one of Sterling's parties, hoping somehow it would find you." As paramedics rushed to attend to Elena's wound, Jonathan kept his arm around her, unable to let go, terrified that if he did, she might vanish again. Over her shoulder, he watched as Sterling was handcuffed and led away, the man's face a mask of thwarted rage. "Mr. Reed," one of the officers approached, "we'll need statements from both of you, but it can wait until tomorrow. For now, get your wife to the hospital." Wife. The word struck him anew. She was real. She was here. She was alive. 3 weeks later, Jonathan sat on the balcony of their beach house, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. Elena dozed in the chair beside him, her shoulder nearly healed, her face peaceful in sleep. The investigation into Sterling's crimes continued, with evidence mounting daily of an obsession that had spanned decades. Margaret had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. Sophie and her mother had received an anonymous donation covering all medical expenses, plus a college fund. Vega had been handsomely rewarded for his services, though he seemed almost disappointed that the case had been resolved so quickly. As for Elena, each day brought new discoveries, new challenges as they navigated the aftermath of their 2-year separation. There were nightmares for both of them, trust to rebuild, unspoken fears to address. But there was also this, quiet moments together, the chance to begin again. The vibration of Jonathan's phone broke the silence. The Bayside Project. Another crisis, another demand for his attention. 2 years ago he would have answered immediately, prioritizing work over everything else, that Jonathan had died the day he thought he'd lost Elena. He silenced the phone and reached for Elena's hand instead. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his with a smile that still took his breath away. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. "Perfect," he answered and meant it. Just perfect. The ring glinted on her finger, catching the last rays of sunset, no longer a symbol of what was lost, but of what had been found. Of time reclaimed from the very jaws of grief, of a second chance neither of them would waste. Some promises, after all, were worth keeping. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.